Hi, my name is Lee Ann Whippen, and welcome to this episode of Blue Ribbon BBQ. And today I'm going to share with you my recipe for competition-style brisket. Let's get started. Today I have a beautiful brisket from Linz Meats. And it is a Heritage Angus brisket, whole brisket. I like my briskets in competition to be a minimum of 17 pounds. 17 to 18 is great. This was cryovac. Another pro tip is I like to age my brisket. So once I buy the brisket, I age it in my refrigerator for at least 3 weeks. So we'll take this baby out of the cryovac. When you are shopping for a brisket, I have some key points that you're looking for. There are two muscles in your brisket. There is the point and the flat. The point is this big, thick piece of meat here, and the flat is the flat section. For competition, I look at the flat and I try to get it at least 1.5 inches to 2 inches. This is because this is where your slices are going to come from, and that's going to go into your turn-in box. This is the fat cap, and it's on this side. On the underside, when I look at a brisket like this one, I look for striations of fat, marbleization. I want heavy marbleization in that. Also the color, that it's kind of like a bright red. That's another good indicator it's a good piece of meat. Sometimes I'll lift a brisket up right from the center and it flops down. To me, that means it's going to be tender as well. So let's get to trimming this. Sharp knives, a must. I like to start with the underside of the brisket. There is a piece of skin, the silver skin, that is on top of the flat, and you have to be very careful removing this. And the reason why I remove it is to allow your dry rub to permeate the meat and get the flavors into it. So you want to always cut away from yourself and try to make smooth cuts because you don't want to get gouges into your meat. Sometimes it's easier if you lift it up with your hand and then move your knife down like this. It works for me. Another pro tip, if your meat is cold, it's a lot easier to do this. So I'm going to remove the silver skin very carefully. And this is going to take some time. It's meticulous work. Sometimes if you lift up the silver skin and move your knife along, you can remove it as well. Again, I put my hand underneath and I can get better leverage on it. Nice smooth cuts. Once you remove all that silver skin, then I go to the point side. There is a big fat, almost feels like a baseball right in there. I try to remove that as much as possible. Now I could go in with the point of my knife and dig this whole thing out like some people do, but I think that's enough because again, the slices are going to come from the flat, and fat is flavor, so I kind of like to leave this in there. This is not going to be that important when it comes to your turn-ins. Also, I like to take care of all of the extra fat along the side. And these scraps, you can keep them. You can grind them up and you can make some nice hamburgers with it. Another important thing when trimming a competition brisket is to square it off, and that means cutting the edges straight like this. So when you go into a 9x9 box, it's going to be even on the edges. So I cut down the side, trimming all of the fat off. A lot of people, when they buy their briskets, they'll talk to you about buying choice or prime or wagyu. This is a heavy piece of meat and it's going to cost a lot of money. I feel like with this method, you can take a choice brisket and turn it into almost a Wagyu tasting brisket. Again, I'm trying to cut this and trim it into a rectangular shape, and I'll show you that in a minute. Remember, these are not going to go to waste. We're going to save those. So you can see how I have it in a rectangular shape. Now I'm going to flip the brisket over to fat side up. If you hold your brisket up sideways, you can see how thick your fat cap is. I think it's super important to keep a 1/4 inch on there. You can see it's thicker on this side, thinner on that side. So you have to be very careful, but I'm going to start with the thick side, again, cutting away. And I don't want to go all the way down to the meat. It helps me sometimes to lift this up and just follow it across. You got to leave a little fat on there to protect the meat and to give it some flavor. This is actually a very well trimmed brisket. I like to turn in burnt ends in my box, and that comes from the point. It has a lot of fat and marbleization that goes through it. I actually take this fat cap off of the point because I'm going to show you later how we remove it for those burnt ends. So about 2/3 of the way, I kind of score it a little bit just to make a point of reference. And this is where I'm going to start removing the fat. This you don't have to be so meticulous with. You are trying to get completely down to the meat. And this does not have to be perfect like the underside had to be. And I'll explain that later. Again, there's my point of reference, my little cut. And I get all the way down to the meat. It has enough fat inside this end that's going to protect it and keep the moisture in. See, got all that fat off. This does take some time. I'll be honest with you. When I trim a brisket, it probably takes me at least a half hour to 45 minutes. You are going to hit that. You're going to see this. I'm going to show this to you. This is the fat line that separates the point from the flat. So the flat runs all the way across here, and this is the part that we're going to use for burnt ends. Now the next step is I like to inject the meat. And I like to use Butcher's Barbecue, his beef injection. I just think it's fabulous. A lot of people use it and it works for them. Again, it helps with flavor and moisture because brisket is a tough meat to cook. I turn it over, and the reason I do this is because I want to inject. I don't want to have to go through that fat cap, and I also like to watch where my needle is going because you can see the grain. It's running like this, and you don't want to see those injection spots when you slice it, and you're less apt to do that if you follow the lines. So my new favorite tool is the Pit Boss dual action because it's a sprayer and also an injector. And I want to tell you, this injector works better than any other injector I've ever used. I'm really not just saying that. All you do is pump it just to get the pressure inside. It has a nice long injector with the holes in it. And when you inject, it's important, don't jab it all over the place. You need to start at one end and methodically go through evenly at each point. For my brisket injection, I like to use about, I would say 1 tablespoon of injection per pound of beef. So I'm going to start at this end, and I'm going to follow that fat line, make sure that the hole is all the way down there, and simply press this lever here. And as I'm pressing it, you can see the injection going right through, so you know you're getting the pressure. And as I'm injecting, I draw it out slowly, so it's not creating pockets of injection in your meat. That's not good. So you slowly draw it out. And sometimes when you're doing this, it's going to squirt out. Don't worry about it. Just as long as you follow. And just like in a pork butt, when I'm injecting, I kind of think of it as a grid, an invisible grid, and inject, draw it out, and just keep going point by point, evenly across. And you'll see the meat puff up too. That's just an indicator that your injection is going inside. The brisket does not have to sit with this injection in there for a long period of time. You can put your rub on immediately, which we're going to do next. Again, follow the fat lines. Sometimes this will squirt up in your face. I've had brisket injection face before. Oh, just like that. As you get further into this thicker cut of where the point is, you're going to be putting more injection in that. For obvious reasons, it's a bigger piece of meat. You do not need to inject into the fat. That's not going to do anything for you. At this point, I like to turn the brisket over, and because the point is on this upper side, I've already injected the flat side. I want to make sure I get it into the point. You're going to see that everything has changed. The lines are going in the opposite direction. So again, you follow those lines when you inject. And that's it for the injection. So now we're going to move on to the rub, and I'll make the rub that I like to use for my competition brisket. Now I'm going to make my dry rub that I like to use on brisket. I really tend to favor that salt, pepper, garlic kind of Texas style brisket. I feel like the judges like that too. And it enhances the flavor of the beef. I don't really like that sweet sugary taste on my beef brisket. So we're going to take a 1/4 cup of kosher salt, a whole cup of large ground, like cafe style black pepper, a little seasoned salt, Lowry seasoned salt. I do about a 1/4 cup. A lot of people use powdered garlic. I like the granulated garlic. I feel like it mixes in better in your rub. The powder sometimes will clump together. This is more even for me. And I will take a whisk and whisk it all together. And keep in mind that if you have leftover rub, don't let it go to waste, and just store it in an airtight container, and it's good for a couple months for sure. Mix this really well. Next, I'm going to talk about binders. Binder is what you put on your meat, and then you put your dry rub on top of it, and the binder helps that rub adhere to the meat. Sometimes necessary, sometimes not. If your meat has a lot of moisture on it, it's going to hold the rub itself. I like to put a light coat of Worcestershire sauce on it, and quite frankly, you could use yellow mustard if you want to. You are not going to taste the binder. At least I don't think so. So I actually have a little bit of the injection that has come out, which I like, because I can use that to rub around as my binder. So I put it all over, including the sides. And then we'll flip this over and put the Worcestershire on again. Making sure to get it evenly across. I'm going to start by cooking the brisket fat side up. So that means I'm going to start with the rub on the bottom side, not to disturb the rub that's on the top side, if that makes sense. My rule of thumb is as much as the meat will hold for a dry rub. So we will generously put this on, making sure to get an even coat. You don't need to rub it in. You can just pat it on there. And you can tell by the color, it's very salt and peppery, which is what I'm looking for. Today I'm using my Pitmaster Austin XL. I have it set at a temperature of 275 degrees. I am using Competition blend pellets, of course, Competition. So I've made sure that the smoker has come up to temperature before I put this meat on. I also feel as if putting on a brisket when it's cold, for some reason to me it makes a better smoke ring, so I do not let it come to room temperature. And then we're going to put the rub all over, making sure you get all the sides. It's pretty. And that's it. And it's ready to go on the smoker. Big argument is fat side up, fat side down. I'm not going to get into that. I'm going to tell you what I like to do. I like to start it off fat side up for a couple hours. Now, because it's competition, I'm going to be turning in the flat side, which this is going to end up being the top. So not to confuse you, fat side up for 2 hours. I'm going to flip it, so I'm going to get that nice bark on the other side, which is going to be top side up in my box. This is probably going to smoke for 5 to 6 hours before it gets to an internal temperature, which I like at 165. At that point, we're going to do a wrap on the brisket, which really helps with the moisture and tenderness of the brisket. So we'll be right back. The brisket, after 2 hours, I flipped it from fat side up to fat side down, and it's been rolling about another 3 hours. I'm looking for an internal temperature of 165 degrees, and I'm going to check it now. I think it's pretty close. It has really nice color. I did take my spray bottle with a little bit of apple juice. It looked a little bit dry, so I spritzed it just a little bit to moisten that up. I'm going to take the temperature in the middle of the brisket. It's at 168, which is close enough for me. It's not an exact science, this barbecue. We're going to leave these guys on. I have taken butcher paper, peach paper, and we're going to put the brisket on this paper, which I've doubled up, so I folded over twice in the middle because this is not wide enough to fully enclose the brisket. You can use foil if you'd like to. I've done it both ways, and they're pretty darn close. We're going to place the brisket in the middle. And we're going to take this paper. And we want to get a nice tight seal on this. So I fold it over this way. And we're going to carefully make sure that when you cut your butcher paper that you get a big piece, because you don't want to run short for obvious reasons. We're going to fold this over. It's almost like swaddling a baby. for all you dads out there. So we have it nice and tight. And just to make it easier for you to see, bring it this way. As you can tell, I've used quite a bit of paper. And we're going to start by rolling the brisket. Make sure the sides are in. And there you have it, that's the brisket. So we're gonna go ahead and put this back in the smoker at 275 degrees. It's probably gonna take at least another 5 hours or so, so I'll check it maybe in 4 hours, the internal temperature. I like an internal temperature of about 203 to 204 degrees, but there have been times that I've poked it with a thermometer and it still felt tough and I had to bring it to 206. So the probe of my thermometer is the real test. If it goes in like butter, then I know I'm there. So we'll put this on. And we'll wait for that. At this point, the brisket has been wrapped and it's been on for a total time of about 10 hours. I'm shooting for an internal temperature of 203 degrees, but until this temperature probe goes in like butter. I'm going to poke it right through the paper in the center of the brisket. And as you can tell, there's no resistance. It's like butter. So I'm very, very happy with this. I'm going to take the brisket off. This is where you have two options. You can rest the brisket. I like resting it for 4 or 5, even 6 hours in a cooler, closed cooler, wrapped in a blanket. I do, however, like to let some of the steam out because I don't want it to continue to cook. I would say that's kind of a pro tip. So I'm letting some of the steam out. And if I was not going to make burnt ends, I would just wrap this back up and put it in the cooler for, again, 4 to 5 hours to let it rest, let those juices redistribute throughout the brisket. It's going to stay nice and warm for your turn-ins or for your company. It'll give you time to make side dishes, dessert, whatever. You can see that the bark is set. It's just beautiful. It's the color I'm looking for. Again, the rub has a lot to do with it. Salt, pepper, garlic. There's no like sugar in there, but it looks beautiful to me. I'm going to leave it in the paper because I'm going to rewrap the flat after I take off the point. I'm going to separate the point from the flat. On the thick part where the point was, you can see how it's kind of split, and that's because fat runs through it, and that's why that's happened. I'm going to insert my knife. I let my knife guide through there. It'll slide through the fat so that there's no resistance. Simple as that. This is now the point. This is now the beautiful flat. I'm going to get rid of the excess fat because this is from that big chunk that I said felt like a baseball. Okay, we don't need that. Going to take the rub that we had left over before and put it on the cut side because we want some flavors to get into those burnt ends. Just pat it on all the way around. And we're going to take this whole piece and we're going to put it back on the smoker. It's going to take another hour or two. I like to let these come up to 212 degrees internal temperature approximately. I want the bark to get darker than this for a burn end. So it might even take 3 hours, it depends. But I'm going to put this back on. I'm going to rewrap this flat because this is going to be turned in for our slices. And now we're going to go into the rest mode. It's already steamed out, so it's not going to continue to cook. And this is going to go into the cooler for as long as I can let it be there. It'd be nice to get 4 or 5 hours on it, and it'll stay nice and warm. Again, if you don't have a cooler, you can even wrap it in like a moving blanket. That'll do just fine. So it's ready to go. Now I'm going to talk about the brisket burn ends. We cut off the point. It's been on the smoker for about another 2-3 hours. The internal temperature I'll check. It's about 214 degrees, which is fine. It seems like that's overcooked, but not for the burn ends. We'll take that off. I have a half pan here. The darker the side is the side that I'm going to use for the top side. You can take an electric knife to get your cubes out of it. I'm just going to use this sharp knife today. I like about, I don't know, 3/4 inch, 1/2 inch cubes. And you can feel that this is just, it's incredible. So I cut the cubes across like this. In a competition box, I usually put 8 cubes in there, so I'm going to cut more than we need because I always like to pick the best. I cut with the grain there. Now I'm going to cut against the grain, being careful not to disrupt the rub on top. It feels so tender. I could eat it right now. Take a spatula, put this into the half pan, keeping the dark side up. The reason I don't do the beef broth first is because obviously the meat's going to go into the pan, the liquid's going to push up, and it might go over the top of those burnt ends, and I don't want that to happen. I want the dry rub to stay on there as a nice bark. So I carefully add the beef broth till it goes about, I don't know, 1/3 of the way up on each of the cubes, just 1/4 way up. Careful not to disrupt the top of it. I do want to tell you about an option. If you wrapped your brisket in foil, it's going to render those juices versus the juice going right into the paper. And I take those juices, put it in a degreaser, degrease them, and I take that juice, add it to my beef broth, and that goes into the pan. But today we use the butcher paper, so we're using straight up beef broth. And make sure you use the low sodium beef broth because there's plenty of salt in that dry rub. You don't need to have it too salty. So we're going to seal this up. Again, put it back on the smoker. At 275 for about an hour, and then we'll be ready to go. The brisket flat now is resting in the cooler for 4.5 hours, which is great. It's still nice and toasty warm. We're going to remove the paper. You can see on the flat, the lines of the grain. We want to cut across the grain. So I'm going to start cutting at this point across the grain with a very sharp knife. Everyone's different how they like their brisket. I like to think for competition, a pencil thickness is good for a brisket. So we're going to start here, cutting across the grain. And again, you can use an electric knife for this. A couple tricks. If your brisket is undercooked, cut it thinner. It's going to be more forgiving. If it's overcooked, cut it thicker. I want to show you something. It doesn't get much better than that. Look at that smoke ring. It's beautiful. Also, the big test is the finger test, right? So this end is a little bit overcooked because it broke, but I know that as we get further in, it'll get better. And typically in a box, I like to put in 6 to 8 slices. I don't really like sauce on my brisket. But seriously, look at that. It's absolutely beautiful. Pit Boss really does it well when it comes to smoke rings and smoke in the meat. Judges, when they have your brisket, there's a couple things they look at. They kind of pull it apart. If it falls apart real easy, it's overcooked. If it's like an elastic band, it's undercooked. My favorite way to tell if my brisket is done right is the finger test, where it just drapes over your fingers and holds together, and this is perfectly cooked. I talked about the 2 muscles on the brisket, the point and the flat. The point has a lot of fat in it. You can see that in there. Always cut against the grain. This is going to run differently than your point, so you have to look for the striations. So you're not going to be cutting lengthwise like this. You're going to be cutting across. Even though they're shorter pieces, that's the way you cut your brisket. Look, again, beautiful smoke ring, very tender. Beautiful bark, Texas style. And now we're going to get into the burn ends. Steamy hot. For a brisket box, just for competition's sake, I'll tell you, I like to have a minimum of 6 slices. I like to angle them like this so you can see the smoke ring. Take note, I injected the brisket and there are no injection marks on here. And as I showed you, that technique is to draw out your injection needle, and that will help from getting you those puddles or pools that you really don't want to have, because there'll be like gray dots in there. And the judges will pick up on that as well. So I'll place these in the box like that. I'll pick out my favorite burn ends, and I'll put them at the base. I always put a minimum of 6. Sometimes I'll throw in an extra for good luck. And that is my competition brisket. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Blue Ribbon BBQ. And for the recipe, please see description below. See you next time.